Okay, good afternoon and welcome back from your lunch break. I hope everybody enjoyed this morning's sessions. I certainly the ones I was in were great, lots of lively discussion. So this is the breakout session where we'll be discussing scaling up computing for AI and data tools. And we'll have plenty of opportunity for what I hope will be a really lively discussion. The session will be chaired today by Dom Cushnan. Dom joined NHSX in January of this year and has been instrumental in setting up the NHS AI lab. During the pandemic, he worked at industrial scale of collaboration to deliver a national COVID chest imaging database for tech companies and researchers. Also in quick succession, he published guidance on the commissioning of AI technology that helps not only the healthcare system, but also provides vendors with a clearer picture of what the healthcare system is looking to buy. So with that, to introduce today's session, I will hand over to Dom. Dom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Jerry, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you did enjoy your lunch. We're looking forward to an interactive session with my esteemed colleagues across the board here, talking about scaling up computing for AI and data tools. I've got three fantastic individuals to have this conversation with, Jim Hendler, Kane Hughes, and Laura Robinson. And they're going to spend a few moments doing a little bit of introduction to their work and the wider ecosystem before we get into a Q&A session with yourselves and the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jim Hendler, who is the Tetherless World Professor of Computer, Web and Cognitive Sciences and Director of the Rensselaer IBM Artificial Intelligence Research Collaboration. Jim has authored over 400 books, technical papers and articles in the areas of semantic web, artificial intelligence and agent-based computing and high performance processing. He comes with experience working with the IEEE, the AAAS and the ACM as a fellow. Has also worked with DARPA and is also one of the first computer scientists ever to have served on the board of reviewing editors for Science. I'm going to hand over to Jim to do some introductions, but we have the absolute privilege of inviting you to the session. Jim.
Thank you, Dom. So, there was a movie based on a comic called The PhD Movie, and had one line I really loved. You walk past the room where there's an old computer science professor, and he's saying, "I remember when we only had one bit. And so my students have started saying when I introduce myself with a story, it's usually going to be a 1-bit story. And so I thought introducing this panel, I had a very good 1-bit story that was, after having prepared all sorts of remarks yesterday, they all got put in perspective because of this report that DeepMind had, quote, solved the protein folding problem. Now, in fact, it's more limited than that, but it's still quite an achievement. And it reminded me that almost 25 years ago, a colleague and I had an approach to that problem, was not based on that technology and have no clue whether it would have worked. And the reason we have no clue whether it would have worked was to have made it work, we estimated we would need 20 to 30 grad students to hand code all the molecular models in a form that the computer could read them. And then since we had one of the largest computers at a university in the US at the time, this was back at the University of Maryland, we would have only needed the entire machine for about a decade running to be able to do one experiment. Now, that's just putting that in perspective. The group from DeepMind had access to 170,000 machine readable encodings of proteins in their foldings and had, they were running actually on a relatively small configuration, which was probably 100 times the size of what we had available, if not bigger. So in a sense, what's really the breakthrough here has been a combination of three things that are all in that story. A lot of work in new kinds of architectures that allow the scaling, lot more availability of data at all sorts of levels that goes from genomic and all the various omics to, population health data, individual health data, those who are lucky enough to get access to patient data. You can, it's now not uncommon to talk about running some test algorithm on 100 million patient records, things like that. And then we move to the algorithms. And I think today's session, we really have all of those involved. Now, I thought rather than talking about my own work, to put this in a COVID context, I'm posting in the chat a pointer for those who want to take a look. Back in March, a group of a few companies, it was IBM, I believe Amazon, and I'm not sure who else, and then 2 or 3 universities, my university, MIT, and actually that was the starting group, and then a couple companies, and some national labs, all of whom had supercomputers, agreed to make available pieces of our computers to be shared for people who needed access to run COVID-related work. The consortium now has 43 members from around the world, companies, universities. We have almost 100 projects running. There are 6.8 million cores available across all of the systems, includes dedicated supercomputers, AI supercomputers that have CPU and GPU capability. Somebody did a back of the envelope calculation that we have about 600,000 petaflops available for computation. So in a sense, one of the things that's really exciting in this space right now is that we've reached the point where scaling, getting access, those kind of things isn't really the bottleneck. But what isn't a challenge still, what kind of computations, et cetera. So in COVID, we have people who are using fairly, let me call them standard to mean that they're a few years old, techniques of modeling and simulation of protein attachments, very genomic things. So we know quite, in some ways we know more about the COVID molecule than we know about how COVID spreads, right? So we also have epidemiological studies where we're taking all the data we can, we're doing predictive analytics, things like that. So essentially we live in this world now where getting access to data and getting access to computation is less of a bottleneck, but where we really still need breakthroughs is in what kind of models, how to run them, how to make them more general, how to make it so that you don't need super specialized knowledge and access to one of these machines. Some of the computations we've been running use, a small piece of one of our big computers, say 1 million core hours, right? Which sounds like a lot until you realize how many processors you have. So, but it's still a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money. So we really believe that this scaling of computing, this availability of data, and now sort of the growing algorithms, including AI-based algorithms, modeling and simulation, and sort of graph-based spread models, really have reached the point where we're starting to make medical breakthroughs quickly and in new ways. So I'll stop there. That's kind of my generic introduction to where we're going, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about some more specific work as we go. Thank you.
Jim, that was super helpful and sets a really great context for the next person I would like to introduce, which is Kane Hughes, who's the informatics lead within Google Health Research, and very timely based on what you've just discussed. Kane joined DeepMind in August 2015, starting DeepMind Health, becoming part of Google Health specifically in 2018. He himself has helped design and build Streams, DeepMind's health clinical facing mobile application. And before joining Alphabet, he was an NIHR academic clinical fellow in ENT at the University College London Ear Institute, with specific research interests in artificial intelligence, health informatics, and epidemiology. I'm looking forward to introducing Kane. Kane, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Jim. Hopefully I'll be able to follow on from some of what you've said. So thinking back on different terminology, I guess that I'm probably involved in a multitude of informatics and then had big data and machine learning projects over the last decade or so. But I think the focus of my work over the last 6 years has been almost entirely in the application of deep learning and specifically convolutional neural networks to medical data, both on electronic health records and the sort of multidimensional records that we get out of modern EHRs, but also in medical imaging with some recent promising results in ophthalmology and cancer imaging and other such similar domains. And what I think I've seen over that time has been a really interesting evolution, because we originally found ourselves building, in our case, dedicated England-based computers to ensure that we were meeting the information governance standards of the day. Whilst in recent years, we've been able to take advantage of more scalable cloud computing infrastructure, thanks to updated cloud computing guidance from NHS Digital and the advances in internationally recognition of standards like ISO 27001, for example. And I think the accessibility of those sorts of scalable, cloud computing environments has been a key enabler for some of the HDR hubs, like Insight, which I'm very involved in as a collaboration between ourselves, University of Birmingham, Birmingham's NHS Trust, Moorfields Eye Hospital in London, UCL, where of course I used to be, and Roche Genentech as our former partner. And to me, I think this is an interesting hub to talk about as we consider scaling of compute for data research. Because Insight, we're trying to pull together both imaging and non-imaging data about patients in a linked pattern to try and enable this new field of research that we call oculomics. Where in oculomics, we're aiming to enable researchers to answer not only eye health questions, but also to look for those signs of non-eye disease within images of the eye. For example, we hypothesize that there might be key early signs of cardiovascular or neurological disease visible in the eye that researchers could potentially build algorithms to detect based on the data sets that we're pulling together as part of Insight. I think it's very timely to be talking about these multimodal data sets, because there have been some incredible advances over the past few years in what's possible within trusted research environments. And we've seen groups like Open Safely, especially over the past couple of months, have shown what's possible in the context of COVID EHR research within the safety of these environments, and without necessarily moving patient data from the environments in which it's normally stored. And I believe that we're not quite there yet, but the next few years we'll have the opportunity to see the success of research in these trusted environments in mixed modality research, like those enabled by the Insight data sets. However, what I think is interesting for us to all consider, and which we may have an opportunity to discuss in more detail today, is how we will succeed in producing high quality research in these secure environments. What will be the flexibilities that are needed on the part of the researchers as they find new ways to debug their algorithms and their trainings? What would be the new kinds of compute resources, be they GPUs or CPUs or some of the novel machine learning specific processes that would need to be made available in these trusted environments that aren't available today? And then finally, I think an area which we really should engage with patients, the public on, is what are the varying degrees of consent that we might need from a patient, whether their data is being made available, let's say, in aggregate for training within a trusted environment, in raw form for direct access by researchers, maybe to debug a specific failure mode of an algorithm, or to ensure algorithmic fairness or lack of bias. You may need specific examples from people with certain protected characteristics, and potentially right up to public publication by researchers. And I'll use two examples from some timely research. Many of you may have seen a really lovely paper published in JAMA Open by Microsoft Research today, showing some of the really stunning work that they have done in radiotherapy, an area that I have been really passionate about for a number of years. And I thought it was really fabulous in that paper that they could not only show the results of their work in isolation, but also show the performance of those algorithms against a publicly available test set, which we had the opportunity to make available based on some cancer imaging archive data a couple of years ago, because the patients involved in that study had consented to the availability of their data in public for the advancement of research. And I think that what we're lovely to see is more and more opportunities of that, and opportunities where we can see public data sets available that represent the whole spectrum of people that make up our population with deep ethnic and demographic data. Because there are specific examples, even in imaging and cancer-based research, where we can think of, let's say, Asian patients with a predisposition to certain types of nasopharyngeal carcinomas, cancers of the nose, where if we don't have publicly available examples of those patients and those cancers, we could inadvertently, as a community, train algorithms and do research that underperforms in those sections of our society. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Dominic, and hopefully give some interesting thoughts for the conversation we move on.
Absolutely brilliant, Kane, and a great summary of other activities as well that others are doing, and definitely that new JAMA paper. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Laura Robinson, Health and Life Sciences Lead from Microsoft. Laura leads the UK Health and Sciences team in Microsoft to support the mission, specifically of empowering every person to live healthier lives and every organization to deliver better healthcare. She herself is responsible for a team of industry solution executives, account executives, and account technical specialists who strive to help healthcare customers digitally transform to deliver better patient outcomes, enable stronger care coordination while delivering clinical and operational efficiencies. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I think, through COVID, what we've witnessed from a digital transformation is just unprecedented. During a 3 to 4 month period, we saw innovation that typically would have taken us 4 to 5 years. And with that, it's an exciting time. I think everybody appreciates the value of health data, but very few have really figured out how to fully harness the power and the good that it has in a universal way. And that's why it's exciting to see the collaborations between the NHS, research, academia, and industry flourish like it is. We had a firsthand opportunity to work with other industry collaborators in the building out of the COVID data store, which brought together 19 different data sources in one repository. And not only did that allow the NHS to manage the crisis, but it also allowed for the public-facing and the internal-facing dashboards for Public Health England. And at no other time was access to data, visualization of data, the use of data to make decisions any more relevant. We've also witnessed firsthand the ever-increasing demand for trusted research environments, allowing clinical and research data to be curated and stored in a safe and compliant way for the purpose of better understanding both COVID and non-COVID workloads. We started working with Gosh and Iridia 3 to 4 years ago, and now we're part of the HDR UK International COVID-19 Data Alliance, and we've supported that through an initiative at Microsoft known as the AI for Health. But to Jim's point, it's amazing to see the power and the growth of compute, but it needs to be democratized. And that's a real strong focus and ambition for us at Microsoft. Most recently, when we announced through our research team here in Cambridge, a project known as Project InnerEye. This is a research project that uses state-of-the-art machine learning technology to build tools for automatic quantitative analysis of three-dimensional medical images. Project InnerEye is exploring ways in which machine learning has the potential to assist clinicians in planning their radiotherapy treatment so that they can spend more time with patients. That's really what we think the true value of enhanced and more prolific AI is. How do we enable the clinicians to do what they're there to do? Planning radiotherapy treatment can be quite a long process for complex cases. The manual contouring of the images can take hours, and that's just for one treatment. There's variability, there's subjectivity, it can be open to human error, all of which would impact both the patient experience and potentially the outcome, and at a very significant financial burden. So recently we had a peer-reviewed findings through JAMA showed that clinicians using ML assistance can segment images up to 13 times faster than doing it manually, with an accuracy that's in line with human expert variability. We've also created an open source ML toolkit. So not only do we use this resource for ourselves, but we want to open it to the community, and we want them to build upon it in an open way. We've also announced a medical imaging server for DICOM, which is open source. It provides powerful tools to bring those medical images to the cloud and integrate them with metadata and clinical data using FHIR for interoperability. We believe that's another key premise of opening the ecosystem. And so our general belief is, if you feel like the last decade was all about digitizing healthcare, the next decade is about making that digital data good for something. And we feel like that's through the power of accelerated computing, the power and benefit of AI and machine learning. So thank you for having us here today. We're excited about being able to address this amongst our peers.
Thank you very much, Laura. And thanks very much to all my panelists for introducing this session. So we're going to spend some time talking about scaling up computing for AI and data tools. We've covered some of this in the introductions. Please do share questions and comments in the chat box so that we can address any of those comments that you might have. But maybe in the first instance, if I can just ask one generic question that come out of what Kane was saying about how will we succeed in producing high quality research in these secure environments? What will be the flexibility that is needed for researchers so they can find new ways to develop algorithms and use them?
So I'm not sure what order to go in. We'll just sort of break in, or yeah. Okay. You know, I think that's a great challenge, right? You know, as you can tell from what Jen was talking about and others, the availability of data, of course, powers a lot of this, but at the same time, right, a lot of that data is only accessible in certain ways to certain people. And I mean, there's another whole panel going on. As I was joking before we started, that separating the scaling computing and scaling data is kind of artificial in this day and age. But I think beyond the just getting the data components, we also have a lot of issues in data integration, bringing data together. Laura was talking about bringing that commons, or whatever term would be used on your side of the ocean, for bringing 19 data sets together. But where the real challenges are is, once we start doing that, how do we really know what's being represented in that data? So we pulled together data from many, many clinical studies for something we were doing. But of course, each of those clinical studies has a different study population, et cetera. And then we're putting them through these AI algorithms, which essentially we don't have an analytic technique to go through and say, are you focusing only on something or other? We're getting better at that. And I'm sure we can hear more about that from the DeepMind side, because they've done some very interesting work in this space. But it's still, when you have these very large, very complex models, trying to figure out how to probe them is a challenge. So I think it's this really interesting challenge we have today about bringing data together. Still remains a part of our challenge, bringing it together in such a way that we know what the sort of, I'm going to use the word statistics and scare quotes and italics and things like that. You know, again, it's a sample of a population, but we don't know what the population is. We may know what the populations were for each of the different data sets, but the population for the combined data set becomes something that's hard to even talk about. We do a lot of work where we're trying to bring together very diverse data sets into these computations. So it's the scalable computation makes it worth doing this, to bring the things together. But where part of the challenge is we were doing some stuff in children's health pre-COVID. One of the things that was an important aspect of the predictive was the mother's educational level. And this was particularly in certain countries. But we had data sets which had it by grade. We had data sets which had it just by 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years. You know, again, these things weren't mappable in all directions. So we had to make decisions about that integration. And the tools and techniques for bringing those things together are still a challenge, so that the next person using that data can figure it out. And then, you know, then we get into these issues of the algorithm, visibility and things like that. So I'm talking at a very high level, but you know, again, I think it's this interplay between these things that is our next big challenge.
I absolutely agree, Jim, and this is going to be a challenge for some time. I don't know if anybody else wants to come into this, and I know that from the UK perspective, we've got different institutions trying to work with this in a mix of academia, institutions like yourself, Microsoft, DeepMind, and others who are working with us to try and solve some of these problems. Laura, you unmuted yourself. Do you want to come in and?
Yeah, I was going to say from the Project InterEye, that was one of the key problems we were trying to solve, and we called it the generalization of the ML data set. You know, it's very good if you've got one specific data set for one specific trust or one specific, you know, group, but how do you make sure that the algorithm is strong enough to almost go beyond the bias? And so in that case specifically, and again, it leads to the depth and the length of the research project itself. We worked across 8 different countries, and we worked across a data set of 912, I'm going to get this wrong, but 519 pelvic 3D scans and 240, you know, and so it's a matter of creating a large enough population size so that the model itself helps take away some of the specificity, which can be a problem.
So I think I'll jump in on that. I think Laura is absolutely right there in terms of the importance of building these massive international representative data sets, you know, in condition-specific or domain-specific fields. And I think if I drill down into a specific example to I guess, make concrete why that is so useful, is that, you know, as a researcher in imaging, when an algorithm which I'm creating fails on a patient's case, I often want to see the specific example of where it's failed. I want to go through every slice of that CT scan, see it with my own eyes to understand how that neural network has got it wrong. And you know, I think about what do I do? How do I proceed if I can't see that failure? Or if I can't share that failure with the community because it's confidential medical information. You know, on the one hand, maybe I could have tools that will show me just the 10% of how that's failed in some trusted environment, but that doesn't allow me to educate students or the community in how I deal with that failure. So, you know, when I think about this from sort of the whole ecosystem we're building around health data research, you know, might we ultimately need mechanisms, if we have consent to contact the patient, to go back through a hub, let's say, and ask the patient, look, your particular medical image is particularly useful for these reasons. Would it be acceptable to you if it was placed in this commons or used in this way in a publication or something like that? And so there is this question about the sort of evolution of our conversation with patients and the public around this, where we start to, I guess, work backwards across that pseudonymization when these specific interesting cases come up, so that we can build the most useful validation data sets for proving that generalizability that you're talking about.
That's really, really helpful. And Jim, do you want to come in here, and then I can move on to another question?
I'm always willing to come in, but no, I was just gonna throw in real quickly. You know, the other thing I think we have to do is keep in mind that there's still a lot of challenges at the, you know, research level for the algorithms, not just at the data level. You know, my favorite example, and it gets to something John was saying, is we were doing some image analysis work. So we were looking at chest x-rays. And again, we have a system that was outperforming and published and things like that. But the real challenge was those cases that got wrong. And in a lot of those cases where what we find is really it's medical information coupled with that we don't know how to do in ways that are things. So the term neurosymbolic is sometimes used, but it's still at much too low a level. So a good example of that is we had a cancer image which virtually every algorithm and most untrained, actually even trained medical experts were saying this is a tumor in the left breast, right? However, the EHR, if you could look at it, showed that this person had had a mastectomy. So clearly there can't be a tumor in something that's not there. So once you know that, we don't have a way to go back to the system. I mean, we can retrain it, but we don't have a way to sort of say to the system, okay, if you knew this, how would that change the output and things like that. So I think it's not just the availability of data, though that's important. It's also how we take these very different modes of information, these very different kinds of information, and put them together is still very much a research challenge across all of these areas, academia, industry, and government.
That's really helpful, Jim. And I'd like to move on to some questions about validation, but I think I'd like to just pick up on something that Kane said. Maybe we could just follow this through in terms of, so how do we make our AI work accessible to patients and ensure we retain trust and consider that active engagement? In terms of your ongoing work as a group, have you had any considerations on the answer to this question?
So I could come first and say, from hard-earned personal experience, rebuilding trust is much more challenging than retaining trust. So doing everything we can to hold the trust that we have of patients in the public today should be paramount, and acting to the highest standards in terms of information governance and data security and so forth is, of course, key. But I think second to that, when we think from the scientific perspective, both ensuring fairness so that trust extends across the spread of the population and people from all backgrounds, but also ensuring explainability where possible of our algorithms so that people can understand why algorithms make the conclusions they make. Because I genuinely believe, from having talked to people, that in the same way that patients in the public are very understanding when humans make genuine mistakes for reasonable and understandable reasons, people are actually similarly understanding when algorithms make mistakes for understandable reasons. But hardest of all in that, I think, is explaining to people where we have algorithms that are useful in our field, but that are not yet explainable, and how we explain to people that despite the fact that we can't say how this thing works, we think it is useful to use.
Laura.
Yeah, Dominic, if I could, I think Kane hit on a really important note on trust, fairness, and I'd also add bias. You know, there is the ability in a lot of these algorithmic developments to ensure that bias is removed. And that's actually something you can't do in a human scenario. So I do think transparency, I think bringing patients, citizens on the journey with us, I think the more we expose them to the benefits and the good work that's done, the better we are to create more support. You just witness, you know, the citizen engagement when it comes to COVID. I mean, potentially we've overdone it in that case, but I think collectively we could do a better job at sharing and showcasing some of the positives, you know, making sure they realize there's a good news story to this as well, and then advocating on the benefits, and then in truly using AI and ML where it renders a better benefit than otherwise, you know, and I think I go back to, you know, some of the time to market or the efficiencies that are gained. Those are things that if you're the patient, you would value, you know, and so I think it's creating that sense of we're in it together, the transparency, and making sure that they understand the good, the bad, and the ugly, but not just the bad and the ugly.
And I think that, you know, I'd like to resonate on that. You know, one of the issues that we face a lot, both in the consortium, our individual work, and you know, Kane must be facing this today with hundreds of reporters flocking to DeepMind, is separating the publicity that we need from the hype. So, for example, I read what DeepMind published about the work on protein folding, and then I read how it was picked up in things like The Economist, totally different level of claim. One says, we did this experiment and showed this amazing performance on this limited experiment. The other one said, we solved the problem. right? Those are very different, and that causes problems when you then have to explain to the public, no, it's not a solved problem, it was solved, you know. So I think that's always a challenge in all of our fields. But I think that meanwhile, what happens is it gets harder sometimes to explain where the real power has been. I think Laura gave an example earlier that, you know, all of these vaccines that we're seeing now in COVID running testing, every single one of them used supercomputing, AI computing, high data resources as part of getting something that used to take 5 to 10 years to happen in, you know, 1 to 6, you know, let's call it a year. People can argue over how long it took. And, you know, they'll be into market much sooner than could have been possible without this computation. But the role of the computation needs to be explained as part of that much larger ecosystem, as it were. It wasn't that the computer built the vaccine, nor that the humans did it without computers. And I think if we can help explain the role that these high, powerful computing and computing algorithms play in this kind of work, that will help build the trust, because the trust is in the companies and in the people doing the things much more than in the, we don't have to explain the inner workings of the algorithm. If we said these tools help, you know, Moderna get their vaccine to market faster. Yeah. So I think, again, a lot of it is balancing and helping to educate the public in the difference between the algorithms and the use of those algorithms. How's that?
That's really helpful, Jim. And I think one of the comments coming in is, you know, we appreciate the complexity of the landscape of not just educating ourselves as research groups and workforces around this, but also the public at large. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. The scalability of this conversation during the pandemic has introduced statistics at the very minimum to have a more robust conversation about what we would like from the use of algorithms in our clinical settings. I'm going to just I'm going to ask 2 questions, and we can take either or. Just conscious that we've got about 10 minutes left. So the first one being, how have you addressed the challenges of validation for AI data tools? And I'm interested in this as well through some work we've been doing in the AI lab and how we think about validation and the strategy for that, working with the regulatory bodies. And then the other one, which I think is quite interesting in terms of scalability, is how do we scale, this is from Sushil Varma, in terms of how do we scale researchers to leverage the modern architectures, and how do we scale train compute providers to understand research challenges and address their needs? And I'm happy to take either of those because both of them are quite interesting.
So I'm happy to jump on validation. I think that validation is one of those areas where, essentially, insofar as possible, we need as many disparate and representative data sets as the community can reasonably make available. You know, it is one of those areas where the more data that is available for validation of an algorithm, and the more data that is made available on an ongoing and a rolling basis, then the better that we can ensure fairness, ensure minimization of bias, and effectively ensure the safety of the algorithms that we have created, or indeed identify when that performance starts to drift over time, so that we can undertake the necessary retraining. So on that front, I think that it essentially is in everyone's interest on a sort of country basis as much as anything else to ensure that there are representative validation data sets for their populations, you know, so that even if there is an algorithm, let's say, being imported from the UK into Ireland, that has been adequately tested on an Irish population to ensure it performs appropriately.
Yeah, I'll just maybe support what Kane said, and we might not be representative with regards to working for global companies gives us permission and the opportunity to look at, you know, I think about our research team. We have some here in Cambridge. We have them dispersed globally for that reason, you know, to give us access to a global footprint of both data, but then also insights, algorithmic challenges, peer reviews. So I do think it's important to question the validation and make sure that it's representative, but also holistic where and when possible. And I know that's not the case in every research venue, but I think that's what they need to strive for.
Yeah, can I pull this thread a little bit more? It seems like it's got the audience excited about validation. So Alison Kay from UKRI Innovate UK makes a great comment based on what we've just discussed. How do we think about validation over time, and how do we determine the frequency over which accuracy should be revisited? Any comments on that? Nope. Maybe I can come in on this one if that's helpful. But Jim, go on, Jim.
Please don't.
Yeah. So I think this is kind of putting some of the work of the NHS AI lab. This is what we've been thinking through in terms of working with regulatory bodies, in terms of what are the gateway processes that are required for specifically, and we, sensitive to the language that we use here. It's kind of we use different words to mean different things, but how do we ultimately do retrospective validation in a way that makes sense on a regular basis? And I believe people like the FDA have a paper out at the moment in terms of how they think this through in the regulatory landscape, and what lessons can we learn from the types of questions they're asking about this total product life cycle of an AI model, and what are the touch points that you want to increase performance, and do you then have to go and get a further assurance check on that? And these are really helpful in terms of how we think about the model development, and especially if we want to think about continuous learning algorithms where we really want to get to. It makes for a very interesting debate. Jim, over to you.
And yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also one where we need to bring in policy and ethicists. We're having a big, we've been having a communication, let me just call it that at the moment, in the US between the FDA, our enforcement agency, our regulatory agency for device. And it really gets complicated, not just algorithms, because we're also doing things like, take your embedded, you're blanking on the name, the thing that keeps you from having a heart attack, your monitor, but or an embedded diabetes pump. I tend to work more on the diabetes side. Now you have something where there's a software component and a hardware component. We've gone through regulatory issues, we've gone through clinical trials, we're proving it's not killing people, but it's also getting regular software updates, which now are starting to include updates that are coming through machine learning, or it may be self-adjusting. So now we're going to change the algorithm that does the self-adjusting. We can show in the lab that the algorithm has improved. Do we need to go through a new clinical trial, which would be crazy if we're doing that every time we fix a bug in the code, right? On the other hand, if we make a major change in the algorithm, to not go through some kind of validation. So we don't even have the language for some of this stuff in the computing technology, let alone when we're taking the data that was gathered locally and had an algorithm running there, pulling that data into our supercomputing space where we're doing the big analysis. That gives us some parameters that we're then downloading back to the device. So again, it's a very complex ecosystem. And I think a lot of the questions that are being raised in the Q&A need to not only be answered by technologists, but by a discussion between technologists and informed regulators. You folks over on that side of the ocean have one advantage, which is with a national health service, at least you're not talking to 1,000 different entities about each of these things, but the regulatory processes aren't that different. And so again, it's getting that conversation started between all the right people. So as these things that we can currently predict start to come to market, we can be sure we've dealt with these in ways that aren't going to cause backlash.
That's really helpful, Jim. I'm conscious that we've got 3 minutes to wrap up. I'm pretty sure, like the rest of the audience, we could probably sit and actually starting to get into the weeds now of the interesting tidbits of technical and regulatory bits of scaling up computing and AI across not just countries, but internationally as well. Just one last question, maybe if we can just get a little soundbite each. I think this is a great, curious question from Andrew Morris. So thank you for a wonderful discussion. A forward-looking question. If we were here in 10 years' time at HDR Alliance 2030, will AI systems have replaced radiologists after all? And that's, can you get that in one breath? Over to you, Laura, first.
I'll say no. We'll always have the need for the human engagement, human interaction, but let's hope that radiologists will spend their time better served for the skills that a human can do and leverage the power of compute where the computer can do it.
Thank you, Laura.
I don't think Laura could have put that better. I would again say no, and hopefully it's simply an opportunity that we can enable radiologists to spend more time with patients.
All I can say is I agree. That's exactly right. But I will say that we do need to put some research and some effort and some research dollars into the symbiosis between the computer and the human. In fact, I know of 2 studies, one which showed that the human plus computer was significantly outperforming human alone, computer alone, multiple humans, and one where the computer plus the human completely failed compared to those, to the individuals. And again, it's because of whether the interface was developed correctly or not. So we also need a little bit of science put into really understanding how to make it so people can better use the outcomes of these devices, both at the research level where we may be changing it and at the application level where people have to learn, at least as it were, the intuition about when to trust the algorithm and when maybe you want to look at the data a little more carefully.
Absolutely. And I think that in itself is probably an hour's topic in itself to get started. Jim, Laura and Kane, can I personally thank you very much for what was a very interesting conversation. I look forward to many more. And on behalf of HDR UK, thanks very much for joining this panel and answering the questions from the panelists. I'm now going to hand back over to Jerry Riley, who's going to move us into the next session.
So just a quick thank you, reiterating Dom's words. Thank you, panelists, for an excellent session. And thank you for all the insightful questions that came through. We could have kept going. There's a number of questions we didn't get to, and there was a few that I was looking to throw in. So great discussion. Thank you for your time. And we now have a short break before we resume with the plenary session. Let me just check the time for that. At 2:30 p.m. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.